Hello, I'm Rod Peppiatt. Welcome to the Avenue Uniting Church congregation in Victoria, meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations. Today we pick up Luke's story of Jesus from where we left off last week. You might remember that it was a parable that he told of a widow and a judge who refused to give her justice. Today's parable story of Jesus is called the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And it's told in Luke's Gospel, chapter 18. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves or rogues or adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus told a parable. 2 men walked into the temple. Sounds like the start of a joke, doesn't it? Except they weren't an Englishman and an Irishman. They were both Jews. One a Pharisee, the other was a tax collector. Now Jesus, the master storyteller, probably paused for a moment to let that last bit sink in. A tax collector praying. Anyway, immediately Jesus sets up the story for a conflict between what his listeners might expect and where the story will take them. And like so many of the stories of Jesus' parables told in Luke's Gospel, this one has a sting in its tail. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Jesus tells of the Pharisee standing by himself. No surprise there, that whole thing of separateness was very important. And he was praying. His prayer is about getting Yahweh, getting God, to agree what a good fellow he is. He, the Pharisee, not he, Yahweh. It's a listing of his better features and practices, and all of them are valuable in themselves. But still, for Jesus, his prayer misses the mark. And that's because it's nearly all about him. The only part that isn't about him is an attack on a tax collector and other people. Thank you that I'm not like him. For the Pharisee, the tax collector is nothing more than an object to be stood on and to make himself look and feel good. Instead of a sense of self based on who he is, the story that Jesus tells says this man has created one based on being better than others or good in comparison to others. And that's his parable of how God operates. Clearly, Jesus' parable has quite a different way of looking at things. In Jesus' parable, the one who goes away in right relationship with God is the one who recognises his need of healing and mercy. He doesn't even seem to notice the Pharisee. There's no hint of, oh God, I wish I was like that Pharisee over there, all faithful and good. There's just, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And the comment is that in Jesus' story, that's enough. Now I could stop there quite easily, and we could all think about what a good storyteller Jesus was and how inspired everyone must have been in listening to his words, And the story could stay there in our minds and our hearts, and it can encourage us to be careful how we think of other people. And that'd be good. But you just know I'm not going to stop there, don't you? Because as I read it and reread it, it reminded me of another parable. This story is also about two men. One of them is Australian. The other is a man from another country. They've never met. The man from the other country doesn't know the Australian exists, and he wouldn't like him if he did. And that's probably just as well, because the Australian has no desire whatsoever to meet the other man. In fact, the Australian is appalled by pretty much everything he sees and knows of the other man. And he's generally okay with that, generally okay with being appalled by it. But just recently, the Australian was shocked to find himself not only disagreeing with the other man, but thanking God that he wasn't like him. The Pharisee all over again. These are the two men. And there's why lots of people didn't like the stories Jesus told. I'd like to suggest that this parable was as surprising or strange or maybe even shocking to Luke's community as my comparison of myself to Vladimir Putin is today. Why compare myself to Vladimir Putin? I could have chosen a less extreme example to make my point, I know that. But my point, and I think at least part of Luke's point, is that Jesus' parable is not only about with whom we compare ourselves, but the comparison in itself. Because such comparison risks dismissing or even not seeing the humanity of another person. So in my version of the parable, the problem was not me being appalled by what we see of President Putin in the media and being terrified what he might do next. I happen to think that most rational and normal people should be worried about that. But no, the problem is not me even wondering whether there are enough people in Russia to overthrow him one day, enough people who are repelled by his actions. No. None of that's the problem. The problem is me comparing myself to Vladimir Putin, whether to boost my own ego or self-respect or to just be dismissive. Well, I may not be perfect, but compared to Putin, I go okay. The problem is me dismissing him as a human being or as someone just objectified by me needing to compare myself to someone. Labelling him as less worthy than me of the love that I name as God. It's a good job Jesus never said that following his way would be easy, isn't it? Because it isn't. It would be very easy for me to see Vladimir Putin as the Pharisee in Jesus' story, with myself as the tax collector, the humble one. But as I hope my parable shows, it's rarely that straightforward, never that easy. Clearly I have discovered I have the capacity to be each character, probably both, the Pharisee and the tax collector. And that surprises me because it's not very often that I compare myself favourably with other people. It's often over the course of my life been the exact opposite. I look at others and think, wow, I wish I was like them. They must be nearer to God than me, or worth more, or something. Now, like most of Jesus' parables, we need to approach this one with some care. As I've just said, we can look, we can compare in both directions, if you like. And humility, which puts ourselves down, is just as destructive as the sort that diminishes others. If we say, I'm not worthy, often enough, we come to believe it. If we're told by others, you're not worthy, even just a few times, we can believe that too. That's the effect on us. So why isn't it the same, the effect on others? I'm sure it is. So this story reminds us that whichever way the comparison goes, it's unlikely to be healthy or realistic for our sense of self. The Pharisee measures himself by another and finds himself above. The tax collector in this story simply sees himself as a child of God with reference to no one else. How then shall we live? Having used Vladimir Putin as a sermon illustration and as an easy target, how do I rehumanize him? I can continue to be appalled by his words and actions, and I think that's appropriate. But it's not my place to compare myself to him, nor is it up to me to worry about the state of Putin's spiritual well-being or status. That's not my job. I could try praying for him. There's a thought. I'm not sure what that looks like, but it's a worthy challenge to put before myself. How do I pray for him while putting judgment on hold? Now, friends, clearly some of this conversation is a flight of fancy, because I will never meet Vladimir Putin. It's a hypothetical because of the distance between us. Although I think the questions around praying for him are actually quite significant. But what about the people who are near to us, who are more closely connected to our story, who are our neighbours? Perhaps with those with whom we compare ourselves, favourably or otherwise. Those we find ourselves judging by whatever criteria, including ourselves. This is a story of how we understand ourselves in relationship with the Spirit we name as God. The Jesus we see in the Gospels expressed and in word, in action, his utter conviction that humanity is loved by God regardless of how others see us or define us, or however we do. Remember the words with which we begin worship each Sunday. Words on our newsletter, our website, and on our church windows. Whoever you are, however you think of yourself, wherever the path of life and spirit has led you, whatever the truths you hold or don't, you are welcome here. Does our self-image depend on comparing ourselves with others? Or are we able to be realistic about ourselves and the holy life within all of us? Beauty, warts, and all. How then shall we live? Jesus told a parable. I imagine that many of those listening to him were challenged and confronted by it, maybe even offended. But some heard. I humbly pray that it may speak to us today as it did to them. In the name of the Holy One, in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen.